All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kayla Marino, and I'm with the Virginia SBDC network. For those of you that are not familiar with our organization, the Virginia Small Business Development Center is a partnership program between the U.S. Small Business Administration, George Mason University, and local host institutions throughout Virginia. With 27 locations across the Commonwealth, we provide training and technical assistance to small businesses in their local communities. Our one-on-one consulting services are available at no charge. Today's webinar, Benchmarking Beer and Spirits, How to Leverage the Power of Data, is presented by the Virginia SBDC Network. We are recording today's presentation, and it'll be posted on our website, virginiasbdc.org. Due to the large number of participants, everyone's microphone is muted, and if you have any questions during the presentation, you can type those into the Q&A box. We've also enabled the live transcript function, which you can show or hide via your meeting controls. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today's session. Go ahead, Chris and Chris.
All right. Thank you so much, Kayla. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this conversation about how breweries and distilleries can use data to track performance. So as Kayla said, my name is Chris Van Orden. I'm the manager of the Craft Beverage Assistance Program at the Virginia Small Business Development Center at George Mason University. The CBA program is designed to provide industry-specific assistance to Virginia's craft beverage sector. So today's program is going to be a free-flowing conversation about the importance of benchmarking for the craft beverage industry. You're going to be able to enter your questions into the Q&A function as we go along, and we'll do our best to either answer them in real time or save them towards the end of the presentation. So I'm very excited to introduce Chris Farmand, the founder and CEO of Small Batch Standard, a financial agency built to serve the craft beverage industry. With a team of consultants, accountants, tax consultants, and industry experts, Chris helps breweries and distilleries deploy data toward improved operations. Today, I'll be asking Chris to share insights on how Virginia producers can refine their business through benchmarking. Welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Chris. I'm excited.
Yeah, well, before we dive into particular metrics, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on the data that a craft brewery or distillery should be capturing and what systems they should have in place to collect that data.
Sure. So we have like a recommended software stack that we suggest all of craft manufacturers have in place or work toward, and that starts with a accounting system, a GL software such as QuickBooks or Xero. And that's going to be really the heart of the software, right? That's going to be hard to build all your financials and really categorize everything. Equally as important to the GL software is going to be some industry specific software, and both beer, wine, and spirits have their own industry specific softwares. And what's important about these packages are they're for spirits and beer, they're really capturing grain to glass. For wine, they're capturing grape to glass. And understanding batch cost, understanding recipe costs, finished goods per SKU, what that loss is throughout the process, what we refer to as WIP loss, is really critical in determining what you make more of, what you make less of, what mistakes not to make again. So a brewery or distillery or winery without industry specific software really is flying blind, because you're building an assembly, right? There's an assembly of items that go into a recipe, and that recipe goes through a process, and then that process is packaged, and then the package is sold. It's so critical to be able to manage that whole process, plus manage finished goods inventory, raw materials inventory. Most of these systems do that. And then really the third piece of software would be some sort of AP document management system, right? To handle the money going out, right? Most craft producers have two sources of money coming in. They have a retail, which can be a tasting room, can be direct to consumer. It's any B2C, right? It's any producer to consumer sale. And the other side is wholesaler, B2B, or B to distributor, or right. Those are the two main sources of revenue coming in. Your online store is also retail. So the money coming in is pretty, while it's not simple, it's straightforward. The money going out gets a little bit more complicated. So we recommend a a strong AP software in place, in addition to the accounting, in addition to the industry specific production software, if you will. Oh.
To what extent do those different systems talk to one another? Are they often integrated, or is it the kind of thing where you have to have a little bit of expertise or put in some work to make sure that everything aligns?
No, certainly they're integrated. You want them to be integrated, and most of them these days will integrate among the various platforms. So your main accounting software is going to be, like I said, QuickBooks or Xero. Most of the platforms for industry specific will play nice with those. And the integration is important because it's hard enough with everything else that the brewery, distillery, winery is doing to get the information in there. Taking that a step further and transferring that from one system to another, it would be near impossible to ask, right? You're getting into some serious accounting heavy lifting. And the reality of today is with all the technology and all the APIs that we have, that software syncing and talking to each other should be a given, right? It really should not be a sticking point or a decision point, right? It should be expected, and it should be happening. So without a doubt, those systems should be speaking to each other.
Okay, great. So let's assume that a company has the mechanism to collect all of the required information, everything from, the production side, accounts payable, and their, the revenue streams, all of that. What kinds of benchmarks would you say are fundamental industry wide? So what basically should every single company be able to tell you very quickly? How often should they review those, and how do they kind of relate to business model? I know that's a lot.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's a good question. And I kind of go back and forth between the term KPI and benchmark. I don't like KPI because I think KPI is very generic, and really you can apply a KPI to a brewery, and you can apply the same KPI to a law firm, right? Versus a benchmark is really defining that goal or that bench where you want to be against your peers. What we have done at Small Batch Standard is we've taken a step back and we've looked at, what makes spirits and beer so unique versus other just craft manufacturers in general. When I say craft manufacturers, I mean bakers, I mean dessert places, woodworkers. What makes craft so unique is, a local bagel shop is making a bagel in the back for 10 cents, 15 cents. They're selling it up front for $1.59, right? Cake shop, same thing, right? Or not same amounts, but same margins, if you will. There's only so much you can get for a bagel, so much you can get for a cake, so much you can get. But when you look at beer doesn't cost a whole lot to make. But when you bring it up to the front of the house, you're selling that for $6, $7, $8 a glass. The margin is far wider than even a local coffee roaster. Like I mentioned, the other craft places. So where we've landed with our benchmarks is we want to know how much the craft producer is making or selling in wholesale and how much they're selling in retail. The margins are so wildly different that a producer selling 90% wholesale and 10% tasting room, tap room is going to have pretty different benchmarks than a producer making 10% wholesale, 90% tap room, right? It's so different. So, and we have created silos for each one of those. We've created about 6 silos. So I think we have 90-10, 80-20, 60-40, 50-50, and then back up the ladder. And what we found is when you look at a producer in your same silo, it doesn't really matter what your size is or how old you are, your geographic region. Unless you're selling a pint for $15, if you land between that $7 to $9 range for a pint, you're going to be pretty similar. You could have more earnings, you could have less taproom labor percentage, but it's going to get you in a range. So that's what makes the producer so unique when benchmarking is really what that revenue split is, and where is the revenue being derived from, versus, just a standard benchmark based on barrels, or benchmark based on age, or benchmark based on region. And once you establish that baseline, then you can start going deeper and saying, well, all right, well, what does it cost to make an IPA in the Pacific Northeast or Northwest or Southeast? And that's what we're stumbling upon now. But really the baseline is what are the revenue streams? I think your exact question is how often should they be reviewed, and how are they impacted? Is that correct? The benchmarks?
Yeah, if there are, I mean, it sounds like depending on the revenue share, right? What that split is, you're going to have different benchmarks that you're tying to. You're going to say, hey, if you're 90-10, you should have be looking towards this particular number for this calculation versus somebody who's got the inverted, so it's important to know where you fit in on that front. Yep. So the types of things that they may want to be looking at when they're in that space. So let's say I'm an 80-20 in-house limited distribution. I should be looking at things, cost of goods, margins, what types of things should they be looking at, and how much time and energy should they be putting into kind of dialing those numbers in?
Yeah, definitely. So across the board, we look at the same metrics. Just the outcomes are different. So we're looking at cost of goods sold, and we want to see cost of goods sold as a percentage of revenue. And our definition of cost of goods sold is if you've been following our stuff, we're big fans of ECOS. Most of our customers will use ECOS, so we really go with the ECOS recommended chart of accounts for cost of goods sold. We'll add in excise tax. We'll add in brewery expense. The only items we throw in a brewery expense are chemicals, yeast, and gas. Those are the three items which are extremely difficult to tie to a batch, right? Unless you have flow meters, unless you have electric meters, unless you're using a fresh pitch per batch, which that would be really expensive, but maybe you are. Those things are hard. So we just lump those, we expense those at the time. And those are really the chart of accounts that we look for. I'll sometimes come across massive chart of accounts. We don't include production labor, and I'll tell you why in a second, because we benchmark that separately. So as a baseline, we're looking at cost of goods sold. Next, we're looking at earnings, right? We want to see earnings as a percentage of revenue. Next, we're looking at debt to asset ratio. We want to see where the debt to asset ratio is for that particular brewery. Next, we're looking at cash on hand, cash to G&A expenses. Okay. Then we get into labor. We track everything based on 4 categories. And I'm kind of dating myself here based on times have changed over the last 2 years, right? But the OG labor categories are production, admin, outside sales, and taproom. That has seriously evolved over the last 2 years. We now have back of the house. We now have kitchen. So we've adopted to a few more labor categories, but if you're still running a production brewery with a tap room, you can keep it to those 4 categories: production, admin, outside sales, and tap room as labor. We're looking at revenue per square foot in the tap room. We're looking at revenue per barrel in the tap room. We're looking at some operations metrics. We're just letting the brewery know about their operational capacity efficiency, right? Based on what they could produce versus how much they did produce versus how much they produced in the past 12 months. We're looking at revenue per barrel in wholesale. We're looking at advertising as a percentage of revenue. We're looking at occupancy as a percentage of revenue. So those are really the crux of the benchmarks that drive the bottom line. I know that's a lot to kind of throw at you, but that's really what we're looking at across the board.
But you raise a good point. Those are all things that everyone needs to be looking at. It's not some of these are maybe second nature to some people, but the other ones are just as available. It's just a matter of doing the work, running the reports, seeing where you stand, and knowing, as you said, the first thing important is to know where you stand, which silo are you in, which track are you on, because all of those numbers are going to shift in terms of what you might want to be hitting, depending on how you put your product out into the market. That's the huge part of it. It's, it's not a one size fits all, and we're starting to see, so many more people pursue diverse models. It's not just a distributing brewery versus a brew pub anymore. Those distinctions are starting to fall away. So, you mentioned a little bit the past 2 years. Given the altered landscape that we've all been forced to traverse over that period, how would you recommend producers think about calibrating their sales strategy? So whether it's packaging mix, readjusting their revenue streams, what kind of things should they be looking at to determine what changes they might need to make?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very, very good question. And even more recently with this competition report that came out from the government, I don't know if you had a chance to read that, but that was a huge, huge report. And that had been in the back of my mind for a while now. So when we're talking internally here at SBS, we're talking revenue silos, right? That's the first thing we talk about. And in a recent, internal dialogue between me, my COO, our lead consultant, I mentioned that I'm really concerned about the 90-10 and the 80-20 breweries, so wholesale heavy, right? Distributor heavy. And the reason I'm concerned about it is the breweries that are taproom heavy have far more flexibility on pricing. They have far more dynamic pricing, and our ability to pivot, their ability to pivot when they need to, is supported by that direct consumer model, whether it's through taproom, whether it's through online sales, whether it's through, I know we're talking Virginia, and when I talk, I speak like nationwide, right? So I got California in my mind, and I've got Oregon in my mind, and I've got Virginia in my mind. So when I say direct consumer, I'm talking your tap room, I'm talking shipping in state, I'm talking like whatever your state allows. So the wholesale heavy breweries do not have that pricing flexibility, and costs have increased big time. Yes, there has been pricing increases over the past 5 years or 6 years, but not at the rate of inflation and not at the rate of price increases. I had a great talk yesterday on my podcast with Augie Carton, and he was talking about this exact same, this exact same topic, that, in the last few weeks, a burger has gone from, in the past 6 months, a burger's gone from $14 to $21 without blinking an eye. A beer has not gone from $7 to $12 a pint. So beer truly is lagging in that inflation index. I've seen a lot of distributors force price increases, and that triggers some really crazy clause that, okay, if we force a price increase, the distributor forces a price increase, well, we're both going to split on that, even further increasing their margins, versus the brewery stepping up and forcing or suggesting a price increase. So I'm saying all this to say that wholesale heavy, and one of my metric, or one of my sayings from day one, is, in manufacturing, you win on price or you win on volume. Well, craft is light manufacturing. Light manufacturing can never win on volume. You're always going to win on price. When you put all the 2 and 2 together, the 4 and 4 together, right? It's not a recipe for good, right? I don't see a good outcome at the end. Add to that distributor consolidation, and add to that just what's happening overall in the landscape, right? I'm seeing more breweries that move into more a heavier retail focus as being more successful. That was a long-winded way to say that. A super long-winded way to say that. More retail operations, permanent food options. I get a lot of pushback. I never intended to open a restaurant. I never wanted to do this. Chris, this isn't about this is about the business. This is about serving the customer. This is about what you started to do. So if you intended to make beer and serve beer, you've got to figure out a way to do that. And sometimes you have to bend on what you intentionally set up for.
Yes, and I know that the further that product is moving these days, the harder it is to capture everything. I know that your whole model, everything that you do is based on capturing and using data, and doing more yourself is enables you to have more control over those things, have better insights, and make those adjustments. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's people have selected their model, but finding those avenues to shift those ratios to move from one silo to the next, just determine how much of that revenue share goes into which channel. So,
Yeah.
so
I do.
speaking about, go ahead.
I do want to make one more point. Typically, the breweries that have set themselves up for 90% wholesale, 10% tap room,
Mhm.
they opened up a decade ago. They have tons of space. It's a very low rent. Never wanted to open up a tap room in high rent district. They usually have a large brew house, or expanded it, tons of capacity. I'm seeing some breweries now get into fill that capacity with a lower price beer, basically chasing the volume play that I was describing. And while I think that's maybe okay, I thought that was maybe okay, I think a craft brewery coming out with a low priced lager or pilsner may be pigeonholing. There may be unintended consequences, and the unintended consequences are that brewery has now pigeonholed themselves to dedicate what they thought was maybe 20% of their capacity to now 80 or 90%. Let's say that low price lager takes off, right? You've got to make a ton of that stuff. And what was the intention of setting a low price lager to begin with, right? It wasn't just to fill 20% capacity. You can't stop there. You've got to really fill it all, and then you start maybe intentionally cannibalizing other SKUs, other products. So it's a very dangerous game for a brewery shifting from price to volume. I just want everyone to be aware of what that intention, what the unintended consequences could be of that move.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's you start chasing that, and it gobbles up a lot of capacity very quickly.
Yep.
Not everybody has infinite capacity to play with. So, thinking about the kind of revenue streams that might be that certainly command better margins. Tasting room, where that's available to everyone. Obviously, in Virginia, distilleries are pretty limited in terms of that respect. But for producers that are allowed to sell their products over their own bar, do you have any rules of thumb, any types of things that when it comes to tasting room operations that people should be looking at? I know you already mentioned the sort of revenue per square foot in the tasting room.
Yeah, I'll share some of these benchmarks with the listeners. So if we're going back to, if we just had a straight tap room P&L, if you were able to maybe split out your P&L by class. So I would have two classes. I would have a production, and then I would have a tap room. The cost of goods sold on that beer, on those tap room transfers from back of the house to the front of the house, should be no more than 8% of your tap room revenue. So that's really your cost of goods sold, right? Sprinkle in your excise tax, sprinkle in a little bit of brewery expense out of there, and you're talking about 8% of tap room revenue. So there's your COG metric. Revenue per square foot, right? So we go with a standard retail revenue per square foot. This is what franchises look for. This is what Lululemon looks for. They want excess of $30 a square foot. So we say your tap room should be generating in excess of $30 a square foot. Well, what's the usable square footage, Chris? It's the area where customers can congregate, right? It's the area where customers can drink. It's not behind the bar. It's not in the production area. If you happen to have, which I bet you some of the listeners do, because Virginia has so much land. If you happen to have an acre out back and where people can drink, don't include the whole acre. It's going to really skew your metric big time. But use some of it. Use the seated area, something like that. But yeah, you want to be $30 a square foot. And then revenue per barrel. This is a pricing test, right? In the tap room, greater than $1,100 a barrel in the tap room. Without a doubt, every brewery we work with or have done assessment for knocks that out of the park, right? But most all of them knocks it out of the park.
Yeah. But it's important to know if you're not in that ballpark, there's something to be concerned about, right?
Sure.
And if you're outperforming those metrics, great. At least you could feel confident that you are handling that in a good front. Now, there may be other things to be looking at that point. Are your labor costs in check? What's your labor cost per revenue type of thing? Because, if each person in front of house is pouring a total of 5 pints a night, maybe you have staffing issues. You don't have any production issues. You don't have pricing issues. You have staffing issues. So there's always more things to look at. But if you can whittle down the universe as to where that money is leaking out or where you're not capturing what you need, that's what's important. So then, thinking about, hey, people trying to have that feeling, am I on track here? So, even though this is an industry that really promotes a collegial atmosphere, it is an industry like every other one that's about making money. So beyond the sort of simple balance sheet or how much money do I have in my account at the end of this month, what are some kind of ways that a company can take the temperature and just say, we are on a good course? What's that sort of, quick gut check of how is my business performing?
Yeah. So granted, let's assume that all financials are humming and on all cylinders, right? I think that this question goes back to what's the mission, what's the purpose, what's the owner's interest, the founder's interest in moving the needle along. So for some people, it could be how innovative are our taproom releases, right? How wild and wacky are we getting out there? For others, it could be capacity utilization, right? For others, it could be how many account visits did our outside sales reps get to. For others, it could be, so it really depends on what the founders are looking for. I wouldn't say there's like a playbook of other factors of success if the financials are humming. If the financials aren't humming, right? First and foremost, we always go to revenue first. And does revenue feel right? Does it not feel right? Is there room for improvement? Then we start looking at really the areas that drive the bottom line, all the labor, all the COGS. And start making suggestions there. So, yeah.
There's no single right formula. I mean, that's why you have to put in the work to do this thing. It's not just hey, I have my 3 numbers, I'm hitting these ratios right, then we're good. But so you mentioned capacity utilization a little bit. Can you talk kind of more about that space? Everybody, it's always a game of, we don't have enough capacity, we have too much capacity. How should people be thinking about that?
Yeah. So when capacity utilization, we threw on our benchmarks. We did not have them before COVID. They came on with COVID because we just wanted to see where everyone was producing as to how much what the total capacity was. And I think, let's say December of last year, if we looked at the prior 12 months, we had a benchmark of 60 to 80% or 50 to 70%, saying that if you're producing between 50 and 70% of your total capacity, then you're in a good spot. You're in a great place to be, given the fact that most of your product has to go in cans and most of whatever draft you're selling is being sold out of your tap room. The forward-looking 12 months is actually 70 to 90%. And that's where it starts to get a little tricky, because we believe that anything over 90% capacity, production staff gets stressed, potential QA/QC problems, rushed beer. So really redlining the production is not our intention, but also certainly not utilizing our metal is not the intention either. So somewhere to that 79%, it's a simple calculation, right? What's our total capacity? If we ran X number of batches a year, and how much do we plan on doing? Divide the two, and it gives you a percentage. And then you get thinking about that. I would say, once again, with my focus, my research being around the wholesale heavy breweries, there is excess capacity right now. And that excess capacity is being filled with new beers. It's being filled with contract beers. It's being filled with, sometimes it's not being filled. So I would say the excess capacity is an issue. If you're a small producer and you just have a tap room and you need a proof of concept or a further proof of concept on one of your products, reaching out to a large local, or what may be perceived as large local, and asking them to run a batch or two for you, there's no shame in that game. I mean, it's helping them out. It's helping you out. The fact that beer is going straight back to your tap room, you're making plenty on that beer. So I would say, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great point. Just the being mindful of what's happening within your business, but knowing what else is going on out there, because with excess capacity all over the place, I know everybody is always looking to see, well, when do we have to make that next level of investment? And you go from being at 80% of your overall capacity, you put in some new tanks, and all of a sudden you're back down to 40, which is not great. So if you can, build that audience, build that new brand by utilizing of someone else's capacity, it gets you up so that you're not going to hit the ground with those tanks when those tanks come online and be underutilized. There's all kinds of, ways to rely on others and just reach out to one another. I think everybody in Virginia it's a small place. Everyone knows each other. So don't be shy on that, because, you want to make sure that you're using what you need to in your own facility. So speaking of that growth side, so if a company, kind of puts itself through a diagnostic, financials are looking good, it's following along pretty well, expansion might be the next step, whether that's regional expansion, going deeper, capacity, whatever the case may be. How can a company tell when it's ready for expansion with that new facility capacity, whatever? What should they be doing to prepare for that growth?
Yeah, I spoke to a brewery in Canada yesterday, which has won a ton of awards, and they actually, year one of COVID, they doubled, and year two of COVID, they tripled their production. So really an anomaly, right? An anomaly of and they were already doing about 1,200 barrels, and by the end of COVID, they were up to 6,000 or 7,000 barrels. And the gentleman explained this massive 25,000 square foot expansion and carbon negative, and just throwing a lot of buzzwords out. And I sat back and I thought, maybe he is ready for expansion. He's felt the success. He's weathered a really critical time, and there's certainly demand for the beer. But then I sat back and was like, what if he capitalized on that demand? What if he capitalized on the interest in his newly award-winning beers and so on and so forth? So look, I would say expansion today looks very different than expansion in 2014 and 15 and 16. Expansion today is to an additional location, or expanding from a original facility without a built-out tap room to a brew pub. I don't know many people opening a $3 million production facility or expanding into a $3 million production facility, just for the fact that I think there's plenty of them out there. There's plenty of them out there. And if you want one bad enough, I think one could be available if you wanted to move into that model pretty quick. So I would say expansion today is happening due to business viability. The existing business is not going to be viable, is not going to be sustainable. So we need to bring in a profitable revenue stream. The brand is strong. The beer is strong. We're just missing more butts and seats. And that's what the expansion is fulfilling. So yeah, I don't see a ton of tank capacity or tank ordering, like large scale production expansion, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the growth is actually more about moving more towards the revenue streams that are more profitable, either moving from one silo, shifting its ratio back towards a more
Yep.
sustainable, profitable, or opening up another facility that can be that real kind of margin driver and say, hey, we can move volume through our existing facility, but we're going to really open this other one, not to necessarily produce a ton more product, but to produce a lot more profit.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, we did have a question that came in asking about categorizing expenses across classes, so brewery tap room. So are there standards for doing that for things like rent, insurance, accounting?
How to break it out among classes?
Yes, categorizing them across classes. So I think talking about taking some of those expenses and allocating to them to different classes, if that's
sure. A simple answer to that is going to be following your revenue stream. So if you're 70-30 wholesale to tap room, apply 70% of your general and administrative expenses to production and apply 30 to the tasting room, and see how that lands. You're going to have a very profitable tasting room in that matter, but it's also going to stress the wholesale class to kind of see what do we need to increase the revenues to get comfortable just in wholesale sales and distribution sales. So I would start with that. I would start with, what does your revenue stream look like now?
Yeah, so just prorating it based on your existing ratios. Okay, that makes sense. Great. Well,
and I'll also go a step further to say it's really not a one size. It may not be a one size fits all, but for the categories you're unsure of, do it prorated based off your revenue stream. But if you have a large legal bill because you're expanding into a new state, well, that had nothing to do with your tap room. If the wholesale had to stand alone, what would that month look like if you had to apply that legal bill to the wholesale revenue or the wholesale class?
That's a great point. Yeah, not just kind of automatically applying that prorated 70-30, because if there are expenses that can be directly tied to something, it'll also help you to realize the reality of, where are your revenues actually coming from? Where are those expenses going to? And you may realize quickly, wow, this is a cost neutral exercise for us. Maybe we should be looking for other ways to be making money here.
Exactly.
All right. Well, so I know we have touched on a bunch of metrics that, there are a lot of areas that people can be looking at, more time than any one person has to do while also running the business. So that's why you do what you do. That's why a small batch standard exists. So that said, what one or two takeaways would you like craft brewers to take home with them? What kind of key things should people be leaving here thinking, kind of, I don't want to call it homework, but if they're going to go back to their computer after this and start digging in, what should they be looking at?
Yeah. So big thing for 2022 for me is, and I've been saying this every year about running your business like a business, but I really believe the last 2 years have put social causes ahead of business, social functions, social causes, and it's time to push those aside with still following all the rules and being respectful, but understanding that the government money has run out. If we've been running in negative earnings land for the past 2 years, what's going to change in 2022? And just having some difficult conversations, figuring out, is this viable or is it not viable? COVID was a horrible tragedy, but a lot of businesses were propped up by the money that was given out. And I think 2022 is when the rubber meets the road. And I'm suspecting by the end of this year, there's going to be, Bart Watson estimated 30% of the breweries would close the first year of COVID. I think that's going to happen at the end of this year. Maybe not to that extent, but it's going to get a whole lot harder. With everything we talked about, right? We talked about pricing, we talked about inflation, we talked about the shifting revenue models. But with that being said, I believe every craft brewery has an amazing opportunity. They're very resilient. You do have the ability to sell amazing product at really high margins. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom. Just get real with the business and have a serious conversation.
Yeah, not looking at it isn't going to make it go away. These are the types of things these have been a crazy 2 years. I feel like there's no way to have really planned for some of the things that have happened, but we know what has come. We know what everyone has had to face. We know what, things are going to be hopefully opening back up, and all of these repercussions are going to be coming to hit. So it is a time to be taking a hard look at things. This is a business. So I had a couple of questions come in here that I wanted to ask. Somebody was asking for a clarification on the social causes statement that you made. You're talking about things like the sort of charitable elements of the industry. I know that breweries, people get requested often to contribute to local causes as part of their community building efforts. Is that the kind of thing you're touching on?
Yeah. So there's the charity part of it. I would also say that you may be in sort of some in a business deal, or have a alliance or partnership with someone with a business locally, and it's just not generating what you anticipated it to. That would be a social cause. Maybe agreed with your local municipality to do a beer garden or a beer terrace somewhere, and you were eyeing all this retail revenue, but it's not happening due to a number of reasons. That would be a difficult decision where you just say, we're done with this social. I would view it as social cause if it's not making you money. Yep.
Yeah. Some of those things get chalked up as marketing, but unless they're leading to sales, that is what they are. They are, right. It is hard to in this time of belt tightening. Another question that came in, $30 of retail revenue per square foot. Over what time frame? Is that a monthly basis or is that a weekly basis?
Yeah, we look at it just monthly revenue.
Yeah, monthly revenue. Yeah, I know some of these numbers are, depending on how you slice these. We're not talking annual. It's monthly in this instance.
Yeah, I would look at it. I would look at that metric monthly.
Yeah, and that is definitely some of it too. And I'm sure you have all different reports that you set your clients up with. Here are the ones, your weekly depletions versus your monthly. All of these things, have their own natural cadence, and sometimes it's not worth going back to the report on a week over week basis because that's just not the natural flow of it.
Right.
Never mind the seasonality that everybody needs to be aware of if you're looking at monthly reports.
Sure.
There's that too. We had a question that came in about advice for someone thinking of getting into the business of distilling, information resources. So I think somebody who might be in the idea of wanting to get into this area, obviously there's overall business startup things. I should say the SBDC is always here to help with establishing your business, thinking about how to fund your business, whether debt versus equity, small business loans, all of those types of things. There are some trade associations that can help on that front, American Craft Spirits and Discus, although that's more of a advocacy organization. Are there any other types of resources that you would point people to, Chris?
Well, there's the equivalent of the Brewers Association for distilleries. I would definitely plug into those associations, but other than that, I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, I would just say
I will stump for your podcast and newsletter. even though they get into very specific areas, being comfortable thinking that way, I think is very helpful. Again, this is a 1 hour conversation, really covering kind of broad strokes here. Going through just understanding how the model is going to work, it's going to help you shape your business in a way that's going to be more profitable. So looking to experts like Small Batch Standard, honestly, some of it is going around listening and reading as much as you can. And then everybody I've ever spoken to who's thinking about getting started in this industry, I say your job is to go visit 100 breweries or 100 distilleries. And usually people are very upfront about what's plaguing them, the mistakes they've made. And ideally you can avoid them because you'll just make your own, but hopefully they won't be too big.
I agree.
Chris, we had another question about that square foot calculation. I think people really liked hearing some of the specific numbers here. For breweries that also serve food, so brew pub model, $30 per square foot. Presumably that number should be raising a little bit. Do you have or is it an additive thing to a restaurant number, or do you have a different way of calculating that?
We don't have a pub specific, but I would say it should be way over $30 a square foot if you have a full service. If you have a permanent food program, it should be way over $30 a square foot.
Yeah, and there's lots and lots out there in the restaurant space. Of course, realizing you can look at some benchmarks that are out there for restaurants, and then see what you can factor in from the beer side as well. Obviously, it's not a simple addition, but you can find some benchmarks. Restaurants are nice. I had this conversation earlier today about restaurants being a space where there are lots and lots of benchmarks because everything's happening inside their walls. So everything's very easy to capture. You don't have 5 different revenue streams. You have your food and your drinks, and you serve it all to your people. Maybe you have your takeout now, but
sure.
Do we have any other questions people can pepper in if they come up? But Chris, were there any other key areas that we didn't touch on when it comes to benchmarking? I know that there's, you work hands-on with companies to develop their own. Anything that people should be thinking about as they're leaving today?
No, I think we covered it all. The biggest thing is about 2022 should be about, innovation and really making the hard decisions on what needs to happen with the business to make it successful. That's really it.
That's a good note to leave on. So I really appreciate your time, Chris, and I appreciate everyone joining us here today. Thank you so much. And, really appreciate the opportunity to be able to support this great industry in Virginia. And you can always reach out to us at the SBDC, and Small Batch Standard is a great organization. Please, make sure that you find them if you have any needs on this front. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Yep, thanks, everyone. You will all receive an email with a link to the recording and slides, or I guess there weren't any slides tonight, but if you'd like to sign up for upcoming webinars or access recorded webinars, please visit virginiasbdc.org/training. You can also access on our website the COVID Business Recovery Center, where we develop to help owners not only continue business operations, but to thrive and recover. These resources are designed to be used in collaboration with your local SBDC advisors. And you can sign up for a free and confidential session by emailing help@virginiasbdc.org or via our website. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you at our next session.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.